This is Chapter 8 of The Wolf Wilder. They were in open country and the sky was turning evening coloured when the wind began to howl. White and black howled with it. "Old Chort," whispered Feo. Ilya tried to sing, swallowed a gallon of wind, and stopped. The wolves did not usually deign to notice the wind, but Feo could feel Black's anxiety twitching through his fur. As they sped across the snow, Feo saw great chunks of it tumble across the ground, forming snowballs as big as her head. The wolves' tails stuck fast to their legs and the fur was flattened against their skulls. White was struggling, blown into zigzags as they ran. "There's a storm smell, Ilya," she said. "Blind cold." "Is that bad?" "It's not good. It's not even in the realm of good." She leaned forward and whispered into Black's fur. "What do we do now?" The wind gave another howl. It knocked her sideways and slid inside her kneecaps. She felt angry. Feo's body gave a huge unexpected shiver that made Black flinch under her. "Stop it!" she shouted. "I'm not doing anything," Ilya said. "Not you. The weather." "Oh." Together they shouted, "Shut up!" They were, in Feo's experience, 5 kind of colds. There was wind cold, which Feo barely felt. It was fussy and loud and turned your cheeks as red as if you'd been slapped, but couldn't kill you even if it tried. There was snow cold, which plucked at your arms and chapped your lips, but brought real rewards. It was Feo's favourite weather. The snow was soft and good for making snow wolves. There was ice cold, which might take the skin off your palm if you let it, but probably wouldn't if you were careful. Ice cold smelt sharp and knowing. It often came with blue skies and was good for skating. Feo had respect for ice cold. Then there was hard cold, which was when the ice cold got deeper and deeper until at the end of the month you couldn't remember if the summer had ever really existed. Hard cold could be cruel. Birds died in mid-flight. It was a kind of cold that you booted and kicked your way through. And there was blind cold. Blind cold smelt of metal and granite. It took all the sense out of your brain and blew the snow into your eyes until they were glued shut and you had to rub spit into them before they would blink. Blind cold was 40 degrees below zero. This was the kind of cold that you didn't sit down to think in, unless you wanted to be found dead in the same place in May or June. Feo had felt blind cold only once. It had been one night in February of last year, and the walls had groaned with it. Feo's mother had wrapped her in 6 blankets, 5 around her shoulders and 1 for her head and neck. They had stood outside in the cold until Feo was convulsing and gasping for air. Then Marina had lifted her in her arms and carried her back in. "Did you feel that? The cold?" Marina had said. "Of course I did, Mama." "You can no more ignore blind cold than you can ignore a bear riding a lion." "Why did you do that?" "It hurt." "Because I want you to be brave, my love, but not stupid. When you feel that coming on the air, you run for shelter. You understand? You run even if your legs are so cold that you can't feel it, whether they're attached or not. It would be stupid not to be afraid of the blind cold." "But fear is for cowards," Feo had said. "No, Feo. Cowardice is for cowards. Fear is for people with brains and eyes and functioning nerve endings. But you're always telling me to be brave." "Yes. You don't have to do the things fear tells you to do. You just have to lend it an ear, Lapushka. Don't despise fear. The world is more complicated than that." But the weather, up until now, had always seemed on her side. There was something new. Ilya let out a cry as Grace suddenly buffeted towards Black and the 2 wolves collided. "This isn't good," he called. At least, Feo thought, the soldiers would be in the same weather. "Perhaps it'll kill them," she said aloud. "They're older than us anyway." The thought was comforting. Mama had always said, "You will never be tougher than you are now. Children are the toughest creatures on the planet. They endure." The wind blew again, harder, and a snow-covered branch tumbled towards them, scattering the wolves sideways. Feo gripped her knees more tightly to Black's sides. Ilya called, "We need to stop." "There's nowhere to stop." The wind swirled around her tongue and whipped saliva from her mouth. It froze before it met the ground. "Can't we build a shelter?" he shouted. Feo's whole face was stinging. "Where?" They were pacing over what would, in summer, be a vast lake, 10 feet of ice topped with half a foot of snow. There was nothing to shelter behind, not even a passing elk. This is supposed to be what you're good at. It's difficult to pull a face in a storm. The wind keeps trying to rearrange your eyebrows. Even so, Theo managed it. Fine, we'll build a shelter, pile snow, it'll warm us up. Warm up was, she realised, somewhere between extremely optimistic and delusional, but Ilya was starting to look panicked. She scrambled off Black, blinded by her flying hair. How? He said something else too, but it was impossible to hear over the wind. She gestured to him to copy her, and began shaping great armfuls of snow into a ball. Together they rolled the ball across the lake, pushing with their backs and knees, using the wind to help propel it. Theo's blood seemed to defrost as she worked, and soon she and Ilya were sweating, running backwards and forwards with armfuls of powdery snow, piling more and more until the snowball was more a snow hillock. The wolves watched, apparently unimpressed. Grey stood a little apart, and every so often she sniffed, connoisseur-like, at the rearing wind. When the snowball was as broad as a woodshed and as tall as a smallish giant, the two children crouched down in the lee of it. Theo pushed her back and bottom into the snow mound, and Ilya copied, moulding himself a kind of throne. The wind shifted from a roar to a blur. The relief was overwhelming, and for a minute they sat gasping and laughing at each other's frozen faces. They found that if they carved out a dip in the snow wall for their heads, the wind was dimmed enough to talk. Theo fished out the pup and held her palms very gently over his ears. I don't want him deafened, she said, but he needs some air. There's a lot of it available, certainly, said Ilya. Theo pulled an apple from her bag and rubbed the ice off it. Here, she said, you can have first bite. They passed the apple backwards and forwards until it was just the core, which Ilya ate in 3 gulps like a wolf. Theo was impressed. You learn to eat quickly in the army, he said. The wolves laid their ears against their skulls and tucked their heads into their hind legs. White's sides were heaving. Theo stroked her ear, but the wolf clacked her teeth together and Theo shied away. Ilya gasped and pressed himself backwards into their snow barricade. Did she just bite you? His eyes were huge. No, she just snapped a bit. Theo tried to smile, but it was unusual for White to be so short-tempered. She's a wolf, you know, not a kitten. All right, I know. She's tired, that's all. Theo pulled up her hood. We need to get to a wood where she can sleep. Which way, though? To the city. The compass's needle spun uselessly in the wind. I think, over there. It was a very little more than a guess. I think there'll be trees that way soon. We can make a fire. The snow was biting at her ears. Won't we? I mean, don't take this as a criticism, but if we get it wrong, won't we die of cold? I don't know. I don't come out in storms like this, Ilya. You're mixing up being a wilder with being insane. As she spoke, the wind dipped a little, and they heard a new sound. Ilya let out a burp of shock and slapped his hand over his mouth. Theo hid the pup under her hair. They stared at each other. Is that laughing? Said Ilya. Maybe it's the wind. But it wasn't. It came again. Guttural. Theo thought of Rakov and his laugh. Was that a soldier's shape? In the snow? Or a tree? Over there, see, the wolves have smelt something. She tucked the pup inside her shirt and edged out from behind their snowball blockade. The wind punched her full in the face. The 3 wolves came running as she scrambled to her feet, grouping themselves in front of her, facing into the wind. Ilya ducked behind Theo. Grey rolled back her lips. Snow blew at the wolf's face and coated her canines, and saliva dripped onto the ground. But she stayed like that, her hackles raised. The figure was struggling through the wind towards them, shouting something they could not hear. Theo held her knife in both hands in front of her. This is it, she thought. He's come. The figure carried something black and limp, swinging from one hand. Theo squinted into the wind. It looked like he had an axe in the other. Soldiers, as far as she knew, did not wield axes, and his coat, she saw, seemed to be made of ragged squirrel furs. Squirrel fur is not soldierly. The relief of it made her want to leap around, but instead she shouted across the field. Who are you? The wind took her words, so she tried again, roaring, Who? The answer got whipped away by the wind, but their face approaching was a promising one. Theo thought, young and unpanicked. He was grinning, struggling across the field towards them, and despite her ice moustache, Theo gave a quarter of a smile back. What do you want? She called. Need help? he roared back. He was close enough now to see that it was a boy as tall as a man, but, as far as she could tell under the snow, barely older than Ilya. He was starting to look at, partly because of the sharpness of his bones, but mostly because, when he lifted his feet from the snow, she saw he wore socks, but no shoes. "Lost!" he shouted. You must have seen the look in Gray's eyes, because he came no closer, but stayed 5 feet away. "No!" shouted Feo. "Cold!" "Unsurprising!" he roared back as another rush of snow came flying at their faces. He gestured with the thing in his hand. It was, Feo saw, a jackdaw. "Help! Help!" said Ilya fervently. "Would be much appreciated." Feo only nodded as much as her frozen spine allowed. The storm, which renders most people unbeautiful, didn't seem to have touched this boy. His hair was dark, sculpted into wildness by the wind. "Fast then!" he roared. He came closer and squinted at them. He pointed at Gray, at White. "Dogs?" Feo shrugged. It was a shrug that you might, if you wanted to, interpret as a nod. The boy grinned up at the sky. "Quick! Getting worse!" "We can ride," began Ilya, but Feo elbowed him in the belly button and he bit his lips shut. "Yes, come," said the young man. "You hold on to my coat," said the stranger. He held out the edge of his coat. "Going to run? I'll pull you. Hurry!" Thought seemed to occur to him, and he pointed to his chest. "Alexei Gastevsky." Even in the wind, even with the cold coiling inside her stomach, Feo had time to note that the boy was surprisingly bossy. She stared around the clearing, the feeling of unrest growing in her chest. There didn't seem to be any choice. "Come," said Alexei. He set off at a lope, running bent half double in the wind. Ilya's face was white and speckled with ice, but his eyes were bright. Blinded by the wind, Feo ran in the footsteps of the stranger, the wolves following. Every few moments, Gray's nose touched the back of her knees. They jogged northwest, as far as she could tell, through a swaying, creaking landscape. After 10 minutes, Feo's eyes and lungs had turned to ice, and her feet had turned to fire. She was starting to wonder whether death wouldn't be the more comfortable option, when suddenly dark shapes grew out of the white. "Rocks," said Ilya. At least she thought he did. The sound was torn away on the wind. "No, houses," shouted Alexei. They weren't, in fact, houses. It was a ring of ex-houses, 7 buildings set back from the road and with plots marked out for vegetables, all of them burnt hollow, soot mixing with the swirling wind. At that moment, the storm gave a roar and shoved at them from behind, and Ilya stumbled forward onto his knees. Feo hauled him up. "Careful," said the stranger. He gave a guilty, noiseless laugh and gestured onwards. "Come on, very close." They picked their way through the rubble and the snow. There was smashed pottery on the floor and a tin kettle with a foot-shaped dent in it. Black prowled around, growling. It smelt of destruction, Feo thought, and of hard work undone. Alexei beckoned them on. 20 paces away was a stone building not much bigger than a shed. It had one window, and the smoke coming from the chimney looked neat and deliberate. "Here. See, stone doesn't burn well. My sister's place." The boy leaned against the wall under the shelter of the slate roof, panting and grinning. "Go in. What are you waiting for?" The wolves faced the house. They sniffed suspiciously. Black let out a growl. Alexei's eyes widened, and he stared at Feo. It was not an angry growl. In fact, there was a wariness in it, an exhaustion. But, Feo thought, if he didn't know the difference, it might be frightening. "I'm not sure if there'll be room for all 3 dogs," said Alexei. "Maybe," his attempt at nonchalance was not impressive, "leave the angry one outside?" Feo nodded. Gray, she knew, wouldn't go inside anyway, and neither would Black. Houses reminded him of his early captivity, but White's injury was oozing nastily. Feo kissed Black and saluted Gray. "White," she said, "you have to come in. That wound needs cleaning." Black settled himself against the wall of the house and closed his eyes, but Gray paced away, back into the storm, and lay down amongst the burnt houses, where she could see the road. She set her nose to point north. "Come on, White," Feo tugged at White's scruff. "We need shelter." When White didn't move, Feo picked the wolf up by her armpits and dragged her towards the door. White snarled, but did not bite. Alexei was knocking at the door, and as Theo approached, it was opened by a young woman. She wore a baby on one hip and a hunting rifle on the other. "Who?" she said to Alexei, nodding at Theo, who still clutched White in her arms. Theo tried to smile charmingly. She suspected it came out more desperate than she intended. "I don't know. I found them inside some kind of snow castle. I liked their faces. Come on, they need to be near the fire." The woman looked into Theo's eyes, into Ilya's. She sighed. "Come in." She raised an eyebrow as Theo pulled White past her, but said nothing. Her face was very like Alexei's, Theo saw, the same beautiful high bones and sharp edges, but older, and it was muted where Alexei's sparked. Inside was blissfully warm, and the wind, though not silent, was infinitely softer. Theo scraped the snow off her eyelids and looked around. There was furniture piled in the corners, some of it burnt in patches and smelling of charred wood, but beautifully made. A pot of water hung on an iron hook over the fire. The fireplace itself was big enough to stand up in, and Alexei dropped the jackdaw next to the flames. Theo felt her whole body prickle as it came alive in the heat. It smelt safe in here, and soft. Alexei grinned at them and pushed them boldly closer to the fire. Ilya began unlacing his boots. "There," Alexei said. "Now we can talk properly. It's best not to talk too much in a store. The snow gets into your throat. Once my uncle's tonsils froze and snapped off. Honest to God." "Alexei," said the woman, but she smiled. Alexei laughed his noiseless laugh. "What are your names? This is Sasha. She's my big sister." As he spoke, a slab of snow flopped off the front of Ilya's uniform and onto the floor. Under it was his jacket in boiled grey wool, the leather strap across his chest, the gold buttons. Sasha's face went suddenly slack with horror. "Alexei, what have you done?" She fumbled with her gun, struggling to cock it with the baby in her arms. "What? I've done nothing." Alexei looked suddenly younger and more like a schoolboy. Theo stared bewildered from one to the other. "You brought a soldier home. You brought death home for dinner." "No," said Ilya. "I'm not one of them." He had been laughing at Alexei, and his laugh was still on his face, but frozen into misery. "Get out! Get away from my child!" "I wouldn't ever. Nobody would. I mean, you've got a baby." He stopped. "Leave," said the woman. "I swore I would burn the next soldier I saw." Ilya kept shaking his head, but before Theo could stop him, he had turned and headed for the door. 2 tears were skimming down towards his chin. "No, but look," said Theo, and she ran to him and spun him round to face the woman, scraped his icy hair back off his forehead so the woman could see the cleverness of his mouth and the goodness in his eyes. "See, look at his face. He was training to be a soldier, but now, she thought, he's in the pack. He's learning to be wild." "They're not dangerous, Sasha," said Alexei, though he was flushing. "I told them they could come. I said you wouldn't mind." "My father made me. He said I had to be a cadet or a beggar." "He lied and told them I was 15, said Ilya. "I actually wanted to be—" But then he jibbed and bit his lip shut. "No." The woman did not put down the gun. "Alexei, after everything—" Theo took hold of the woman's elbow with both hands. "Please, a man. General Mikhail Rakov is looking for me, and I need help." She needed someone older, who knew facts about the world, and not just guesses, to tell her it would be all right. "Please." "General Rakov?" "Yes, he's taken Mama to prison, even though she didn't do anything at all. He's coming for me now." It sounded so melodramatic to say it that she winced and gave an awkward grin. "Probably." The woman stared at them, a long, sad look. She put down the gun, but kept the baby. "Give me your cloaks, then." Theo saw that the dark patches under the woman's eyes reached halfway down her face. "Come on, don't look so worried. I'll give them back. They need drying." "Thank you." Leah's voice clashed with Theo's. "Thank you so much." They unhooked their cloaks and stood shoulder to shoulder, looking up at the woman. "Tell me what happened."